Welcome to the John Meacham Show. John and I have done many events together. This is our tiebreaker event. We did one event at the 92nd Street Y with my fellow Jews, where he was hounded off the stage. Then we did one event at St. Thomas Episcopal Church up in the Upper East Side with his people, where they threw cucumber sandwiches at me. They were so, and now, so this is our tie-breaking event. We have been friends for a long time, but I doubt our friendship will survive the next hour, because he has just written a very fine and very admiring book of Thomas Jefferson. I myself am an ardent Hamiltonian. In fact, I once gave a speech on the lawn of Monticello, this is a true story, singing the praises of Alexander Hamilton. And this is true, the speech was interrupted by a lightning storm. That suddenly a storm came overhead, lightning came down, and we all had to go inside, and then I finished. And so we're going to have it out between Alexander Hamilton, the man who is really responsible for New York, for this industry, for most of modern progress, and Thomas Jefferson, who would have us all with rakes growing tobacco if he had his way. But we're going to talk mostly about Jefferson.
You have to love this coming from PBS. And just very quickly remind me, did my guy or your guy die in New Jersey after a gunfight?
He was upholding his honor and fighting political polarization.
Warren Rudman has not had a duel.
So the good thing, and the reason I could get through this book, despite the subject, no, it is actually, I read a lot of nonfiction. This is a nonfiction book where you actually are curious to know what's going to happen on the next page. So it was actually very fun to read, and I learned stuff, much of it true. And so, so let's start out. One of the things that comes through strongly in the book is this was a lusty guy.
Yes.
He was not a emotionally reticent stick in the mud.
No.
He wanted to marry other people's wives, or at least sleep with them and stuff like that. So
Yep.
describe some of that personality and what you learned about that.
Well, like a lot of politicians, his appetite for power extended to other things. I won't mention any names, but he's up in Harlem. Hey, man. He, very early on, he was engaged by women. He loved I think he loved his mother. There's some argument about that. His sister, who was very important to him. And then as he became a young man, his interests and appetites broadened. He did chase he chased two women. One he proposed to and failed miserably. She later became the mother-in-law of John Marshall, another one of David's buddies, who was for centralization and central control over your lives. It's a little like Mayor Bloomberg, but hide that, by the way. And he proposed, didn't work out. It was a horrible setback for him. He wrote these very emotional, semi-sophomoric letters about it. Then he chased the wife of one of his dearest friends, whom he had agreed to watch over. Chased her over many years, and of all the scandals about Jefferson, that's the one he admitted. That he said, this was 1805 when he was president, and his enemies had put this out, and he said, of all their charges, I plead guilty to this one, that when young and single, I offered love to a handsome lady. Now that shows how important it is to be a writer in politics, because he did not mention that she was a handsome lady who was married to another man. He fell in love with his wife. It was a great marriage. Her early death was, for him, an almost suicide-provoking episode. He wandered the woods of Monticello with his daughter afterward, and his friends, Madison, Edmund Randolph, others, worried he wasn't ever going to come back down from Monticello. At that point in the traditional biography, up until about 15 years ago, the Jefferson as lover story ends. And then you enter the alleged speculation about Sally Hemings, who was an enslaved person at Monticello. She was also, and I come from Tennessee, so I understand this, she was also Jefferson's late wife's half-sister. Now, where I come from, we just call that, cross-breeding, and we were fine. But she was I think Sally Hemings reminded Jefferson of his wife. And I believe that they had a relationship that lasted from 1787 until the day he died. Nearly 40 years, the longest relationship he would have with any woman. They had, I believe, 6 children, and there is DNA evidence. And I think to argue that a man who had an endless appetite for art, for power, for food, for wine, for ice cream, for collecting, for land, to argue that somehow or another he would then stop short of engaging in the most sensuous of activities beggars belief.
Now, one of the dating tips you get from Jefferson is that he would ask, when somebody would serve him a meal, he would ask in detail about the recipe, which was, and apparently women went for this in the 18th century, maybe still today.
I wouldn't know.
You wouldn't know.
I had 2 dates and got married.
Yeah.
So,
me too, actually. Actually, that moment of the death, his wife's death, is interesting for a couple of reasons. First, because she asks him not to marry ever again.
Right.
Even though their kids are really young, and he's, I think, 39.
Yep.
And the second thing is, at the death scene, I think 10-year-old Sally Hemings is right there in the room.
She's there. She's there.
Now, so my question is, A, do you think there's a moral judgment? Was his wife selfish in asking him to make this promise? And 2, you just mentioned the Hemings relationship that went on so long. Was it a sensual relationship, or was it a deeper relationship, an intellectual relationship, an actual spiritual of equals or sort of equals?
Yeah. Well, on the first, Patty Jefferson had at least 2 stepmothers in her own life. And she had 3 surviving daughters, and she never wanted a stepmother put in charge of the house. And so what she was doing, I think, is protecting her girls more than foreclosing possibilities for her husband. And was it selfish? Sure, but you're dying, you're allowed, I think, to do that. And on Hemings, she was very young, but not by the standards of the day, it was not outside the realm of the common. When John Marshall married, the woman was 16, I think. The age of Annette Gordon Reed figured out that the age of consent in Virginia in that period was 12. So it's just a different time. You have to sort of shift back and judge them according to, what was common for them as opposed to what we think. Arthur Schlesinger used to say that self-righteousness in retrospect is easy, also cheap, and I think that's important. I think that it was more than sexual with Sally because she lived near his rooms. Her main duty when she came back to Monticello was to take care of his wardrobe and his things, which for him, I'm not going to say that Thomas Jefferson was a metrosexual. I'm not going to do that, but he was damn close. He could be very finicky about his things, and he trusted her with that level of intimacy. I think one of the bravest things I've ever read about, frankly, is when this relationship had started in Paris when Jefferson was minister, and she was, according to oral tradition, pregnant at that point. And France had the freedom laws at that time. If an enslaved person came into France, all you had to do was go down to City Hall and declare yourself and you'd be free. And so Jefferson finds himself in a remarkable position in 1789. the world is falling apart around him, obviously. And Sally Hemings and her brother James, who was there, could have won their freedom simply by asking. And Sally Hemings, here's this 16, 17-year-old enslaved African-American girl, young woman, negotiating with the minister of the United States of America to France, the author of the Declaration of Independence, and the man who owned her. And they struck what I call the Treaty of Paris, which was she would come back with him if any children of their union were freed when they were 21. And he agreed. And those were the only slaves that he took care of, which is a further piece of evidence. And so I think it's wildly complicated, it's murky, it's a world of desire and denial. There's a wonderful story about a woman who, in the South in those days, who said that, a white woman, who said that everyone in the neighborhood can tell you exactly whose father is who amongst illegitimate slave children, except for the people on their own place, who of course just dropped from the sky. And that's the world we're talking about.
Now he was, aside from being a lusty guy, he was a sensitive guy.
Yep.
And so most people who go into politics, or even mopes who go into writing, develop a thickness of skin after a little while.
No, he didn't do that.
Right. So what was...
Well, you say that. Do you really believe that?
Yes. Some people do and some people don't.
Lyndon Johnson.
Lyndon Johnson never did. I can tell you a lot of senators never do. Bill Clinton never did.
Never did.
Ronald Reagan did. I can tell you Senator Bill Bradley did not.
Reagan just didn't read it. I mean, that was,
no.
He just...
But I would say he was more sensitive to criticism than most. So
he was. I think that comes from, and as a biographer, I get to practice psychiatry without a license, so I like that. I think he was his father's son. His father was a great man in Virginia, was the co-author of a map, one of the first maps of Virginia. Very tall, very tough guy. Used to gnaw on animals on exploratory trips. I mean, he was a very frontier, strong man. The image that comes back again and again is that he was tall, he was formidable, and I think that Jefferson spent his life trying to live up to the example that Peter Jefferson set. But Peter Jefferson, while love may have been unconditional, we can't really speculate on that, approval pretty clearly was not. It was performance-based. And there's a wonderful story, it sounds like something out of The Last of the Mohicans, where Jefferson is sent, young Jefferson is about 11 years old, he's sent into the woods and told not to come back until he's killed a turkey. And it didn't go well. It was not a quick hunting trip. And so finally he set a trap. He couldn't find one to shoot, so he thought around it. This is one of the ways he later defeated Alexander Hamilton so well. He was a problem solver. And he created a trap, caught a turkey in a pen, brought it home. And I think that like writers, like politicians, like performers of any kind, his hunger for approval is on a continuum with his desire for control, for fame, for power. And you throw in that he was born into a world where he was really born to command. I mean, here's the eldest son of a slave-owning, land-owning Virginian in a patriarchal society in 1743. He hasn't got a lot of challenges to his authority. And as you move through politics, it just became more and more. The other thing, and David writes about this, is a Virginia judge of the era wrote that if Socrates had wanted to be a great man in colonial America, he would have to have gone into politics. Because just public fame, public approbation, all was dependent on your performance in politics at that level.
Well, were they acutely conscious of the decisions of eternity or of posterity? Was that what motivated Jefferson to be
Oh
famous
my
for?
God, yeah. Well, in 1784, he starts making a copy of every letter he writes. Now, part of that's defensive, so because letters leaked out a lot and you would want to answer it. But part of it also was that he fully expected that we would be sitting right here talking about him. His plan worked. He saved 22,000 letters and clearly saw fame in the way a lot of the founders did, which was as reputation as opposed to celebrity. That was the meaning for the 18th century. He and Adams, when they reconciled late in their life, wrote about that they would go to the afterlife and look down on their successors and judge how they were doing in Congress. So my own plan for the afterlife is not to watch C-SPAN, but that is David's idea of heaven.
Yeah.
So
C-SPAN 4, are you kidding?
C-SPAN 4.
Now, why do you think, well, first of all, somebody at that time in 1770s said, you know, we are going to be organizing a country which will hit 300 million people in slightly over 200 years. They were astoundingly accurate about what size the country would have and what role it would play in world affairs. But why do you think that generation, drawing from an incredibly small population, was able to create a number of leaders, any one of which we would be delighted to have today?
Part of it is, I think, I actually don't accept the premise. So it's like interviewing Mario Cuomo. He never accepted a premise. I think that one of the reasons I'm drawn to writing about this generation of people, and any of these people who really affected and shaped the life of their times, is because I think they could have just come off the congressional floor this morning. They were flawed, contradictory, elusive, ambitious, jealous, petty, noble, just the whole panoply of human emotions. And we were lucky in that we had a concentration of them, you're right. But part of it was, and part of the reason they could dream, is they were able to take that political soul, that capacity to maneuver, to compromise, and it was married to this amazing sense, as Thomas Paine said, that we have it in our power to begin the world over again. Well, we don't. David spends his whole life as the House conservative at Pravda up here, writing about the fact that we have to deal with things organically. That was Edmund Burke's whole position. But that generation believed that the Enlightenment had really inaugurated an entirely new era in human affairs. So I think you have an interesting combination of a classic political class married to a moment where they were encouraged and even rewarded for building toward a national greatness.
Yeah. I disagree with you on that. You know, I think we had such a magical generation because they were at the nexus of two virtue systems.
Yeah.
The first was the aristocratic system, which emphasized honor, eternal fame, public service, and lack of self-obsession. And it's worth pointing out that in those days, we have this phrase, public spiritedness, and in those days, it meant the exact opposite for them what it means to us. Now when we think somebody's public spirited, it's someone who signs petitions, get active, vote, make yourself known, occupy, Tea Party, sort of exert yourself. For them, the word public spirited meant repressing your own opinions in order to create a coalition, in order to serve the country. So George Washington was public spirited because he did not express himself. And so it was a mode of aristocratic self-restraint. And they had that on the one hand, but they also had the democratic mode on the other, and the virtues of trusting the people, sort of. And so they combined the magic of aristocracy and democracy into one sort of magic code, which fell apart eventually. And then the final thing I would say, I don't think anybody, and this gets to the Hamilton versus Jefferson. Hamilton did not think we were starting the world again. He thought we've inherited a bunch of wisdom from Britain. They were probably wrong to have a king, but we shouldn't change the world. We shouldn't upend society, or at least the political order. He wanted to upend the economic order and the plantation owners like Jefferson, but he wanted to maintain basic continuity from what we had learned from John Locke and all the others.
That's true, sort of. I think
He just winked at me.
I think that unquestionably it was a generation that I believe saw public service as a necessity. It's what a gentleman did. You owed service to your king, to your country, ultimately to your republic, and believed that they could change things. Now, you're seeing the difference between Jeffersonian and Hamiltonian vision, which I think is the difference between success in American politics and failure, which is the politics of optimism is hugely important. And I've hesitated to say this out loud until now, but the more I did this book and the more time I spent with Jefferson, either he's Reagan in a frock coat or Reagan should put one on, because they both projected a vision of the country as they wished it to be. They were able to clearly communicate that vision to a mass audience through the means of the day, and then they were brilliantly able to compromise, to depart from dogma when they needed to. And they left a system that was one way before they were in power and another way afterward. For 36 of the 40 years between 1800 and 1840, Jefferson himself, or a Jeffersonian, was president of the United States. It's an unmatched political dynasty. FDR didn't do it. Reagan, in fact, didn't do it as well. Andrew Jackson didn't do it. And I just think that Jefferson, in many ways, is the consummate American because he did live in hope. He was, in fact, utterly capable of hypocrisy. I don't know about you all, but I surely am. And yet he believed that tomorrow could be better than today. And that's what separated him from John Adams and Hamilton and even Washington to some extent.
Yeah, I disagree with that too. You know, Edmund Burke has this distinction he makes between reform and change. And reform is, everything always has to change. But Burke said that reform is within a construct. You're changing things within the construct you've inherited. You're not throwing out the construct. And he said change is like, imagine change like you're operating on your own father. And you know you have to do the operation, but you do it with loving care, knowing you don't want to mess up what's already there.
Right.
And so I would say Hamilton and Washington understood they were changing within a system, and they rejected the French Revolution, which was throwing out the whole system. And,
right.
Okay.
But this is a little like Waldorf and Statler, you know, the two guys in the Muppet balcony. That was the critique of Jefferson. He was a womanly Francophile Jacobin. He was going to burn down the White House until he got to the White House, in which case he became a Burkean operator. Even Henry Adams, who wrote an immense history of the United States in Jefferson's years and in Madison's years, finds himself flummoxed when he actually talks about what Jefferson reformed, because he acknowledges that even on the judiciary, other issues, Jefferson knew, and Hamilton knew. Hamilton said that Jefferson was the least likely man he knew to rip up the existing order, and that he would keep things in terms of the political constraints of the day. You can argue that was a bad thing, but as a practical matter, again, he projected an optimistic vision, he knew how to project it, and then he compromised and governed within a frame, as you say, that's not unlike what President Obama does, in a way. I mean, I think sometimes we elect people on waves of hope and change, and Andrew Jackson was that way. To some extent, John Kennedy was that way. FDR was that way. LBJ was that way in '64. But they all find, in the cold light of day, that they are, in fact, inadvertent and perhaps reluctant Burkeans, but Burkeans they are.
Yeah, there's a psychological concept, the fundamental attribution error, which says we assign to traits things that are really explained by context. And so we think we assign other people's behavior to their traits. So if you're in the supermarket and somebody cuts in front of you, you think, what an asshole. But if you cut in front of somebody else, you say, well, I'm in a hurry, I've got a lot to do. And so, but it's usually context that determines how people behave. Now, you've mentioned Reagan, you've mentioned Obama, you've mentioned Clinton. Where would Jefferson be today? The Tea Party claims him on the grounds that the government that governs least governs best. Everyone claims him. So who's right?
Well, part of the problem with writing as much as Jefferson did is you end up like the Bible and like Winston Churchill on both sides of every issue. So I can quote you Union, national greatness, even Hamiltonian language from Jefferson for every Tea Party, every secessionist line about the tree of liberty must be watered by the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure. You know, this is where a lot of right-wing militias have gotten inspiration, and we've seen the cost of that here at home. In almost every case where Jefferson is on one of these flights, it's grounded in something going on right then. One of the things we have to remember is their letters are our phone calls or our emails. They're written with some eye on history, but they're written in a particular political moment, a particular hour. And so when there were moments when he was in favor of increasing the powers of the presidency, which, like a lot of presidents, once he became president, he thought there was much virtue there, to go to David's point about the grocery store. My sense is, in the end, he's certainly not a Tea Party conservative, but he would be, I think, a very effective politician, again, because he believed in projecting a warm vision of the country. He was a uniter, not a divider. His first inaugural, we are all Federalists, we are all Republicans. He believed in the idea of a kind of grand unity. Would he be president? He's more likely to have been on the Simpson-Bowles Commission, in which case the report would have been much more eloquent. But I think he would be one of the statesmen, one of the wise men that we need so much now.
Interesting, because it's interesting that we're talking about this now, because there has been a revival of Hamilton v. Jefferson because we're about to have an election or in the middle of an election, which at its best is a debate about what government should be.
Yeah.
And it's been interesting to watch. I'm a pure Hamiltonian, so I'm unrepresented. I think there should be limited but energetic government to give people social mobility. But I think there are a couple books out now saying that Hamilton was really the Democrat, believed in using government power to give people the tools to compete. There's a book by Michael Lind, that's now another by E.J. Dionne, and essentially they take Hamilton economics, which is activist government to enhance social mobility, and Jefferson view of the people, which is more populist, and they merge those two things together.
Well, Jefferson liked the people as opposed to Hamilton, so that helps. And wanted them to actually be involved in government, so that separates them a little bit. I believe very strongly in cultural and political climate. That is, and I think that presidents, we tend to be pretty reductionist about it. The age of Roosevelt, the age of Jackson, that sort of thing. But there's something to it, and I think that Jefferson, when he became president, he was in political office for 40 years. One of the great acts of misdirection in American history is his tombstone, where he said, founder of the University of Virginia, author of the Declaration of Independence, author of the Bill for Religious Freedom. And a lot of history has followed him. They were pointing that way, and they ran, and we've all followed. But from 1769 until 1809, he was only out of office for about 3 years. So he was a working politician in the most tumultuous years in American history because there wasn't an America when he started. So there's that. And he believed in I think a democratic theory, lowercase d, that was going to gradually expand. And I think he is the author, not just the architect, but the author of the Republican tradition, lowercase r, that ultimately tries to get us to a more perfect union. And I think that habit of mind, that the individual matters, that it's not classes of people, it's not financial systems, it's not political systems, but it's the virtue of the individual, is arguably his greatest contribution.
Okay. We're going to have questions from the floor soon, but I wanted to finish our little part by talking a bit about the book business and about technology. And let me lead into it with a completely unbiased Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian lead-in, which is, and this is my big beef with Jefferson. Let me start with Hamilton. I'm going to get the dates wrong, but you'll get the idea. So when Hamilton was 13, his mom died in the bed next to him. He was adopted by his uncle who committed suicide. Then he was adopted by his grandparents who died within a year. So by 14, he'd lost everybody he ever loved, except for his brother. A court came in and took away his property. So at 14, he essentially had nothing. By 25, he is George Washington's chief of staff and a war hero. By 35, he's been the author of the Federalist Papers and is one of the top lawyers in New York. By 40 or 45, he's retired as the most successful Treasury Secretary in U.S. history. And so he's a story of intense upward mobility.
To date, he was.
Yeah, to date. And so intense upward mobility, and his philosophy was to create a system of government that would allow poor boys and girls like him to succeed. And there were two things in the way of that. One was there were these local oligarchies that were holding down economic dynamism run by rich plantation owners like that bastard Jefferson. And two, technology. Technology was not advancing as far and as fast as he thought it should, and therefore he created federal research projects. He created in New Jersey a research park, which became America's first industrial center. And so he was an enthusiastic embracer of technological innovation, whereas Jefferson, that old stick in the mud, believed in the yeoman virtues of, out there with the backhoe. And so my question leading in this unbiased way to publishing is you have been on all sides of the publishing business at this point. And we are in the midst of this technological change. What have you seen from your various sides? And have you written the book with any mindfulness of ebooks and all that sort of thing?
I think that you're right. I have been on several sides of this. I think centrally, it's got to be a great story, no matter what. If it's a good book and you can get an honest hearing, then I think you're going to be okay. I don't think you can manufacture something because the genre, the delivery mechanism is different. I don't think you can write to a digital culture in that way. What I do think separates the news business, which I used to be part of, from the book publishing business, which I'm now part of, is that book publishers never gave away their content for free. And so what a lot of news organizations are doing right now is chasing their content down the street, trying to erect a paywall, as we call it, after it's already gone. And so people came to see news as a commodity, and they see commentary as a commodity now. Book publishers still have always put more of a value on their books. And I think that not having to put that genie back in the bottle is one of the chief virtues that's going on for publishing. I think it's pretty clear that we're all going to have to deal with lower margins, and There's going to be less cash flowing through the business, but because of the lower digital delivery costs. But that's true. Everything's constricting in this financial system, Hamiltonian economy that worked so well, particularly in '08. Whereas Jefferson was for, actually making things and trying
Talk about your one percenter.
But I really believe, and it's not just a gooey thing to say, but it's got to be a good story. It's got to be a good book. And then you can work out the details.
Right.
And I think that I don't care how people read books I write. It makes no difference to me. But I do know is that if I blew it, or if I wrote something mediocre, then no matter where they read it, they're going to figure that out.
Yeah, I guess my take would be, first, from the Times, 3 years ago, it felt like we were in the whaling industry, that it was just straight downhill. But now there's been this change in popular psychology, so people acknowledge they're willing to pay for content. And at the same time, there's been this flight to quality. And so sometimes
how many digital subscribers does the Times have?
I don't know the number, but I know our effort to get digital subscribers has been a modest success.
It's about, I think, 250,000.
Right, I think that's about.
So then you're going to have to run that business on a quarter of the revenue.
Well, oh, great. Well, I mean, it's a rising 250. I know that our ad sales are now less than our subscription sales.
Right.
And that's 250 up from zero. So I happen to be an optimist until about 15 seconds ago, that there's been this change. The second thing I'd say, and I think this is good for you, Meacham, is that there's been a sharp drop in the number of people majoring in the humanities. And so there are people, especially in economic hard times, are majoring in econ, finance, accounting. They get to middle age, and they say, I missed out on something. I want to know something more about the world that I'm not trained to do.
Yeah.
I once had a rich guy tell me, we were at his vineyard in Sonoma County, and he told me, I've achieved success and not significance. And we were in the middle of his vineyard, and I wanted to punch him in the face. But a lot of people feel that.
Yeah.
And as a result, in middle age, they want to educate themselves and give themselves the humanitarian or liberal arts education they missed out on in college. And so therefore, what they do is they buy non-academic historians. McCullough, Doris, you.
That's interesting.
And so there's been sort of a middle-age re-education process going on, which explains why I think we're in a golden age of biography.
That's a fascinating theory. It was your vineyard, though, wasn't it?
It was not my vineyard.
I think that's right. I think that I also find the perennial, but just because something's perennial doesn't mean it's not happening now, frustration with the political system as it is to be fueling also a flight to either, was there a golden age when things worked? Is there any way we can make things work a little better? Part of what I came out of reading about a hugely contentious era, obviously. Jefferson ruled and ran for office, reigned at a period of enormous religious and cultural strife, external threats, economic pressures. It all feels somewhat similar to what we're facing, and a partisanship where they used to beat each other with canes. And what Jefferson did to respond to that, actually, and the lack of civility in politics, was he had dinner. Every day during the congressional session, he would have guests for dinner, which started about 3:30 or 4. It could go as late as 8. And interestingly, he did not invite Republicans and Federalists to come let us reason together. He only invited one party at a time, because he figured, and he writes this to a great nephew in a wonderful letter of life advice, that he never knew anyone who'd been convinced by argument in a face-to-face situation. It just never had happened. And so he brought in the lawmakers to weave an attachment to him and to explain things, to talk, so that when they went back to Capitol Hill, they would at least remember that their president, their opponent, was a flesh and blood human being, and they'd make it a little more cooperation.
Let's quickly go to questions on the floor. The time got away from me. So if there are any questions, I will repeat. Right here. We'll repeat the question.
Making up for lost time because he was.
What's that? That last part again?
In the reconciliation. At the
the
end.
reconciliation.
Yeah. Thanks. Take on it.
Question was about Adams and Jefferson. Was the opposition that Jefferson led during Adams' presidency ideologically based, or did he just not like him? Both can be true. And I think, Jefferson referred to 1797, 98, 99 as gloomy days of terrorism. The Alien and Sedition Acts, there was a huge anti-immigrant move. The Sedition Act, it was a gag law. Printers who wrote things that the particular grand jury or judge or official of the day didn't like went to prison. And a lot of them did. Matthew Lyon and others, James Callender. And so Jefferson, though vice president, I think really believed that the American experiment was in jeopardy. One of the things, and I also think the reconciliation was genuine, because I think they knew. You saw this last week with the Bush-Obama portrait unveiling. I don't know if y'all watched that. If you really don't have anything to do, go to YouTube and watch it. David has already done that. But at some level, there are only so many people on the planet who know what it's like. And so you're bonded as former presidents. Our friends Nancy Gibbs and Michael Duffy did a good book on this. One thing I want to mention that does go to our Statler and Hilton battle about Hamilton and Jefferson is I argue in the book that you can't understand the politics of the age without realizing that Jefferson really thought, and Madison, that they were engaged in a 50-year war with Britain, not unlike the Cold War. That the Revolution, which we see as the end of an era and everything sort of history's very neat in memory, right? So the Revolution happens, we write the Constitution, and we're off to the races. Next thing you know, Lincoln's around, sort of, that's the way it works. But the Revolution was a tenuous thing. And he was constantly worried, constantly fretting that through Hamilton, through Adams, through New York, that a British financial system could be a prelude to a return of the British to our shores, which was a pretty good argument since they did come back. So he was right. And it was only after Andrew Jackson, just kidding, only after the Treaty of Ghent in 1814, 1815, that war really ended. But I think he lived in an age of conspiracy, an age of complication, an age where he was paranoid, but as Nixon taught us, sometimes paranoids have enemies. One second.
Thank you. This is a question about the publishing industry. So you said the most important thing is to have a good story. So there's a booth out there who explains to you how books are made. And to shorten it down, if you're George Clooney or Lady Gaga, you just send your agent straight to the publishing company. Your book will be in the bookstores and it will be a great success. So the question is, isn't being a celebrity much more important than content or a good story for book sales?
Is being a celebrity more important than the content?
Yeah.
Having read some of the celebrity books, I think not.
No, I mean in terms of sales, not in terms
Oh, from the sales? I guess so. You would know better than I would on that. But I think that platform doesn't equal good book. Platform doesn't even equal book sometimes. And a lot of people, you do, there are politicians, there are celebrities that they didn't write the book, you just hope they've read it. And there have been moments where I've had moments where I've thought they haven't. It's a dislocation, of course, but I think that the more we can exercise some quality control, that's what publishers are supposed to do.
Can I just say I have a much more realistic view? Listen, if you want to write books, you got to get yourself a platform. I mean, it's a pain to do a lot of NPR interviews. But if you want to write books, you got to do years and years of them to get a platform. So it'll
All right,
help.
let's be clear. You live for NPR.
No, I do it because I want to write books, and I know that's the way.
Do
the
you know
profession is
how
shaped.
many tote bags this man owns? He has Mark Shieldses. It's the whole thing.
Our 30-year-old son was visiting us last night. We're in from San Francisco. He lives here. And at one point he said, I can't get over the amount of hatred for Obama. How is it in this day and age? And I'm looking back to Jefferson and, who will write that story and who will believe it? How we have come to this. I'm not sure how to write the story of the degree of racial hatred, as he put it, in this day and age. How did we get here? Somebody has to write the book. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I think we've always been here, and that it's a matter of degree, not kind, is the difference. Jefferson was attacked as an atheist, an infidel. He was attacked for the relationship with Sally Hemings. He was attacked for all sorts of things, as was Adams, as was everybody, Hamilton. In the current climate, I think one of the things that is missing is the people in Washington and in related industries don't know each other very well. One of the things that changed with the fundraising is you have a lot of members of the House who sleep in their offices. That is, they can't build organic connections where they might vote if you're a Republican, they might vote with a Democrat because they build a relationship over a number of years. And that's one of the reasons I was struck by the effectiveness of the Jefferson strategy of don't aim for kumbaya, just aim for, hey, this is a person too. And let's be clear, our greatest presidents, all right, were right for about 15 minutes. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus. FDR rounded up the Japanese Americans. It's just the ability of human beings entrusted after seeking and being entrusted with power over the lives of others is perennial. And the question is, what do you do with that power once you have it? And can you marginally improve the world that you've come to, that you found in the first place? And I think Jefferson passes that test. I think Alexander Hamilton passes that test. I think a lot of people don't.
So if I could just say quickly on polarization on two levels, as you were talking about Jefferson having dinner with the members of Congress, what's been interesting covering the last three administrations is that Clinton was very good at that. He loved the outreach. The problem, as staffers in his White House said, he would make 16 phone calls to Congress, and the problem was his position on call 16 was 180 degrees from where it had been on call 1, so that was sort of a problem. But at least he made the calls. George W. didn't make the calls, and Obama doesn't make the calls. They have very low relationships, even with the members on their own side, just because they don't like doing it. And so there's been that bifurcation. One of the interesting things the founders were sort of right about is when you look at mass polarization, it's not that we've divided on issues, it's that we divided on partisan affiliations. We've given ourselves party labels, and those party labels turn us into ethnic tribes. And the founders were very suspicious of parties, and in retrospect, it looks a lot smarter.
That's very important. The not bad for a Hamilton guy. The idea that I was talking to a fellow who's now in the Senate when he was running for the Senate in 2010, and he'd been in the House for a long time, and he actually, this happens to David too, I think he actually called me up one day while he was eating lunch on a speakerphone to talk about Andrew Jackson. It was one of the odder conversations I've ever had. So he's chomping on a sandwich and talking about Jackson. And I finally said, well, Congressman, how's the race? And he said that the House caucus had never been more conservative. And that the real fear now was not a general election race against a Democrat, but a primary against a more conservative challenger. And he said it's become a verb. You don't want to get primaried. And one of the reasons you see these 99% vote partisan line is every district has their own Rush Limbaugh and their own ability to whip up the grassroots. And they just don't, you know, the purists don't want to see that level of compromise. And you know, as Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. So that's where we are.
Governor Walker in Wisconsin, in his speech last night, said that he was inviting both sides now to beer and brats. Where would Jefferson have come down in that battle, and would he have stood aloof from it the way Obama seems to be doing?
Well, that's a part of the country that would still be speaking French, except for Jefferson. So let's, before I get to Governor Walker, let me just say quickly, the other thing about the Hamilton critique is you're talking about in Jefferson you have a president who doubled the size of the country, explicitly breaking what he thought was the constitutional rule against it, because he compared the country to the award and said that if you're the guardian making decisions for award, you'll explain later why you did this if you thought it was for their ultimate benefit. Sounds an awful lot like the people David hangs out with and admires.
Jefferson wanted the Northeast to secede at one point, so we would be living in some other country.
No.
Yeah, go ahead. I don't mean to interrupt.
No. David would like to celebrate the Queen's Jubilee as a subject.
I was raised in a culture where the phrase was, act British, think Yiddish. That was it.
That's good. David's rosebud, for those of you who want to know, is that he went to Grace Church School. So he is, in fact, an Episcopalian Jew. And I've made this point many times to him, and he's going to someday, I think, come to realize it. I think on Walker, you know, it's bad news for the president. Where would Jefferson have been on that argument? Hard to say. Obviously, impossible to say. Obviously, I think that he would have hated the idea that the legislature fled and that there were angry protests. He loved harmony. His goal in life was very much an Elizabethan in the sense of the music of the spheres. And his ideal was a republic in perfect balance. It was never going to happen, but that's what he thought we should strive for.
This has been a brilliant conversation. I'm loving it. I'd love to get from both of you your assessments based on your respective viewpoints of the candidates and your sense of what might happen in this election. But even more than that, fundamentally, power corrupts, right? That's the given. Corporations and the president have too much power. How do we solve that problem? And systems. We're trying to reform systems, like in publishing. It's crucial. And yet, you can't reform a system. It's changing too quickly. What's the future of both business and the culture, considering those two things?
David knows the future, so go ahead.
Okay, the election, business, and culture. Got it. So, I'll give you my quick election take. And to your point of power corrupting, it's been interesting to watch President Obama, who has found, like most other presidents, that the amount of power he has is much more limited than he thought. I once asked an earlier occupant of the White House on his last day in office, what'd you learn being president that you didn't know? And he said, there's a lot more passive-aggressive behavior in government than I thought. And that's probably true in most organizations, that the president gives an order and just nothing happens. And so as I've interviewed this president over the successive months, I would say each time two things have happened. He's been more aggravated with Washington and what he sees as stupidity all around him, and B, much greater sense of limits on what he can do. And as a result, he's become much cagier. I think he's a much more cagey, cautious person. And I thought his decision not to campaign in Wisconsin was a moral wrong. If he believes in it, he probably knew they were going to lose, he still should have done it just to show I'm with you. But again, that's an element of his caginess. And I think the painful 3 years have taught him that. Romney, on the other hand, if Obama is cagey, Romney is hidden. He's got this great personal story, which is the Mormon story, the story of his family, of really 100 years of getting knocked down and climbing back up. And that's what really drives him, and he can't tell that story because it involves polygamy and Mormonism. So he is hidden from the country. And so both of them are not quite trusting and open the way, Clinton was. And so they're both sort of these weird characters. I personally think Romney's likely to win, in part because I'm very pessimistic about Europe. And this is not Obama's fault. I just think Europe's likely to collapse in the next 6 months and dragging Obama down with it. And then don't overthink the election. If you ask people, are you better off than you were 4 years ago, 35% say yes. That's a tough thing to run in. And so that's my basic take. I think they're both incredibly superior, admirable men, stuck in this rotten system, and stuck with organizations that really impinge their ability to move.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. You all may not know this, so I'll tell you. It was an off-the-record lunch, but I think I can describe what I'm about to describe. Anyway, I'm going to do it. 2.5 years ago, right after the 2009 off-year elections, where it was the first sign that Obama's popularity was not all it could be, David and I, with a group of other journalists, were invited to have lunch with the president. And David was seated next to the president, who I think can safely be said to have a man crush on David Brooks. I've never seen anyone paw someone as much. It was reminiscent of other White Houses in other years. But David is one of the very few people worth listening to very carefully on what the president is thinking, because you get a lot of access. They read David very carefully. I don't think it's quite, if you lose David Brooks, you've lost the country yet, but it's important. And so what he's saying is fact-based. I tend to agree. I think that I think it's very hard if elections are referendum is a referendum on the past, and if the other guy doesn't scare you, which is kind of where you get down to. And Romney, as Bill Clinton taught us, he's qualified to be president, and I think will not frighten people. And so it'll be very close. It's not the only time. We went from 1988 to 2008 without a majority president. Think about that. So for 5 elections, we did not have a majority president. And then 2004, President Bush got a little over 50. This is a 52-48 country. And it just depends on where that 4% go.
We're going to take one more question. We have a minute left. I just want to return the compliment. There actually is a ward committeeman in Chattanooga, Tennessee, who reads Meacham closely.
There is.
And he has great power over that ward.
The mayor.
A mayor.
The
He's
mayor
even
of
risen to mayor. One more question, sir.
Can you hear it?
The question was about corporate lobbying and how they control the candidates. I would say two things. One, candidates rarely change their position based on the donations they get, but they do pay attention or not pay attention to things based on those donations. And I myself, my view of Citizens United has dramatically changed in the past year. At the first, I didn't think it was that big a deal, but now I'm beginning to think it's quite a big deal, that if you, like me, believes in we need to reform taxes, simplify the tax code, well, every single loophole has a special interest behind it. And if that special interest is going to drop $5 million into a congressional race in order to preserve the loophole, that loophole will never get taken away. And so I think the Citizens United case, I'm a convert to this, is profoundly destructive.
Yeah.